But I think it's safe to say that there are three basic, generic types of theology, historically. And theologians speak of them in these general categories. One is what we call Pelagianism. The second is what we call semi-Pelagianism. And the third is what we call Augustinianism. Now, the reason for this threefold designation of basic types of theology has its roots in the 4th century, when the church underwent a titanic struggle over many serious issues of theology. And the man who was recognized and usually acclaimed as the greatest theologian, at least of the first 1,000 years of Christian history, if not the greatest theologian of all Christian history, who defended the faith at that period, was, of course, St. Augustine. And his chief opponent in several debates at that period of Christian history was a monk by the name of Pelagius. And one of the critical things about which they debated was how important or necessary was the grace of God for human salvation. Pelagius was of the opinion that the grace of God assists human beings to be saved, but is in no way necessary. His fundamental assumption was that man, in his natural state, has within himself the capacity to keep the commandments of God to such a degree as to be redeemed without any help from divine grace. Augustine stressed the absolute dependence of the fallen sinner upon the grace of God for that sinner's salvation, and really repudiated Pelagianism as an early form of sheer humanism. And Pelagianism was seen not merely as a subdivision of Christian thought, but really as sub-Christian in its thought. That is, not even worthy of being considered Christian. Now, when I say there are three basic trains of thought that have come down through the church historically, I agree with this setup here. I didn't invent this designation, but I agree with it. These are the three major generic types of theology that have influenced church history. And I see Pelagianism as the father of liberalism, Socinianism that came in the 16th century, liberalism in the 19th century. And so that you'll know where I'm coming from, I would consider Pelagianism as un-Christian, fundamentally anti-Christian, not an option for a Christian thinker. Now, the debates that have gone on within the church between semi-Pelagianism and Augustinianism, which reflected later on in later history between the Remonstrants in the 16th century and the Calvinists and so on and the Methodists, these I would regard as debates within the household of faith. The arguments between semi-Pelagianism and Augustinianism, semi-Pelagianism says that man cannot be saved apart from the grace of God. But there is something man must do, even in his still fallen state, to cooperate with and assent to that grace of God before God will save him. That is to say, he can't be saved apart from grace, but it is left for man, in the final analysis, to either cooperate with God's grace or reject God's grace, and that becomes the convincing point of whether or not a person is saved or not saved. Augustinianism says that man is so seriously fallen that he is totally dependent upon the grace of God, even for his initial response to the gospel, even for the very cooperating and assenting to the gospel of Christ in the first place. And so you can see at the outset that the debate has its roots in the question of man's ability to respond to the gospel in his fallen state. And I would say, as we enter into any discussion of predestination, that lurking always behind the scenes of discussions on predestination is this fundamental debate right here between the semi-Pelagians and the Augustinians. And I also need to warn you at the outset that I am persuaded of the Augustinian view of predestination.